In today's video, you'll hear the story of a group of friends whose remote hiking trip descends into paranoia and terror after one of them begins to suspect that the perfect newcomer in their circle is not human at all. The story begins in the oppressive silence of an ancient forest, where the only sound was the crunch of leaves under 5 pairs of boots. The air in the secluded state park was thin and cold, carrying the damp, earthy scent of pine needles and decaying wood. Sunlight struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting long, skeletal shadows that danced and shifted with the wind. For Jason Smith, the beauty of the wilderness was lost, replaced by a growing, gnawing unease that had taken root in his mind hours ago. It was an anxiety that had a name: Amy. He watched her from the back of the group, his gaze fixed on the effortless grace of her movements. She moved not like a person hiking, but like a river flowing over stones, smooth, silent, and without a single wasted motion. She never stumbled. She never seemed to break a sweat. Mark Douglas, ever the group's documentarian, walked ahead, his camera a permanent extension of his arm, capturing the grandeur of the looming moss-covered trees. He laughed, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the immensity of the woods. Beside him, Sharon Lee, her brow furrowed in concentration, examined a strange fungus on a fallen log, her analytical mind always at work. And between them, holding hands, were Matthew Peterson and Amy Russell. Matthew, Jason's oldest friend, looked happier than he had in years, his face lit with a kind of blissful ignorance that Jason found increasingly unnerving. His adoration for Amy was absolute, a blinding light that left no room for shadows or doubt. But Jason saw only shadows. He saw them in the way Amy's smile never quite reached her impossibly blue eyes. It was a perfect smile, a flawless arrangement of teeth and lips, but it was as empty as a photograph. He saw it in the way she listened, her head tilted at a precise, unwavering angle, her expression one of serene interest. She never interrupted, never fidgeted. She simply absorbed information with a stillness that felt predatory. Earlier, around the flickering flames of their first campfire, Mark had told a joke, a terrible pun that made everyone groan. Amy had laughed, a sound like perfectly tuned bells, but it had come a fraction of a second too late, a calculated response rather than a genuine reaction. No one else seemed to notice, or, if they did, they attributed it to the charming eccentricity of a woman who seemed, in every respect, too good to be true. Jason's boots crunched on a dry twig, and the sharp sound made him flinch. He slowed his pace, letting the distance between him and the others grow. He needed space to think, to dissect this feeling that was coiling in his gut. It was more than simple jealousy or distrust of a new person in their close-knit group. This was something primal. It was the feeling of a sheep that senses a wolf disguised in the flock. He replayed their first meeting a month ago at a small gallery opening. Amy had appeared as if from nowhere, a striking artist with a portfolio of hauntingly beautiful, yet sterile landscapes. She had captivated Matthew instantly. She had captivated them all. She was intelligent, kind, and empathetic, always saying the exact right thing. She was a mirror, reflecting back the best version of everyone she met. Now, deep in the isolation of the forest, the perfection felt like a threat. The wilderness had a way of stripping away pretenses, of revealing the raw, imperfect core of a person. But Amy remained untouched, a polished gem in a world of dirt and decay. He watched as a beetle crawled onto her pristine white sneaker. She didn't flinch or brush it off. She simply stopped, her head tilting with that same unnerving curiosity, and watched the insect traverse the length of her shoe before continuing on her way, her movement so fluid that the beetle was left undisturbed. It was a small thing, insignificant, but to Jason, it was another piece of a terrifying puzzle. It was an act of inhuman patience, of alien observation. The lie was not in what she did, but in what she didn't do. She didn't react. She only performed. They reached the designated campsite as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of orange and purple. It was a small, claustrophobic clearing, hemmed in on all sides by a wall of colossal pine trees that seemed to lean inward, their highest branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the fading light. A profound silence settled over the area, heavier than before, broken only by the rustle of their own movements as they began to unpack. The temperature dropped with an almost physical suddenness, a damp chill that clung to their clothes and raised goosebumps on their arms. Mark and Matthew pulled on thick woolen sweaters, their breath misting in the air. Sharon zipped up her fleece jacket, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Jason watched Amy. She stood near the edge of the clearing, dressed in the same thin, long-sleeved shirt she'd worn all day, her posture perfectly still as she gazed into the deepening woods. The cold seemed to have no effect on her. Her skin, pale and flawless in the twilight, showed no hint of a shiver, no tightening from the chill. Jason stared, waiting for a sign, a tremor, a slight hunching of her shoulders, the simple, reflexive human response to the encroaching cold. There was nothing. She remained as serene and unaffected as a marble statue, a silent, beautiful anomaly in the dying warmth of the day. Matthew walked over to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind and burying his face in her platinum hair. She turned and gave him that smile, the placid, perfect, vacant smile. They worked together to set up the fire pit, with Mark taking charge, arranging the kindling with practiced skill. Jason's movements were stiff, his eyes constantly darting towards Amy, who was now helping Sharon unpack the food supplies. Her efficiency was unnerving. She organized the packets and cans with a logical precision that felt more like a machine sorting data than a person preparing a meal. The fire finally caught, its hungry flames crackling to life and casting flickering, distorted shadows against the black wall of the forest. The group gathered around its warmth, a small island of light in an ocean of darkness. For a moment, a fragile sense of normalcy returned. Then it happened. Mark, adding a larger log to the fire, jostled the pile. A small glowing ember, white-hot at its core, flew from the flames and landed directly on the back of Amy's left hand as it rested on her knee. Jason saw it instantly, a searing orange dot against her pale skin. He tensed, bracing for the inevitable cry of pain, the sharp intake of breath, the reflexive jerk of her hand away from the source of the agony. But there was nothing. For a full 3 seconds that stretched into an eternity for Jason, Amy did not move. Her gaze simply shifted downwards, her blue eyes fixing on the burning coal with an expression of mild, detached curiosity. There was no pain in her face, no alarm. She looked at it the way a scientist might observe a chemical reaction. A tiny wisp of smoke curled upwards from her skin, carrying the faint, sickeningly sweet smell of scorched flesh. Only then, as if a switch had been flipped, did her programming seem to kick in. Her eyes widened slightly, her mouth formed a small O of surprise, and she pulled her hand back with a sharp, theatrical gasp. "Oh!" The sound was clear, perfectly pitched to convey startled pain. Matthew was on his feet in an instant, rushing to her side. "Amy, are you okay? Let me see." She held up her hand, and in the firelight, Jason could see a small, angry red mark, perfectly circular, beginning to blister. "I'm fine," she said, her voice laced with a flawless tremor of vulnerability. "It just startled me, that's all." She gave Matthew a brave little smile, and he melted, cradling her hand as if it were a wounded bird. Mark and Sharon murmured apologies and concerns, their faces etched with sympathy. They didn't see what Jason saw. They hadn't seen the delay. They hadn't seen the cold, analytical observation that came before the performed emotion. They hadn't registered the absolute absence of a genuine, instinctual reaction. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. Later, while Matthew was tending to Amy's hand with the first aid kit, Jason cornered Sharon near the edge of the clearing. His voice, a harsh, low whisper. He described what he had seen: the lack of response to the cold, the 3-second delay before she reacted to the burn. He felt a wild, desperate need for her to believe him, for her rational, scientific mind to see the impossible truth. Sharon listened patiently, her expression unreadable in the dim light. When he finished, his breath coming in ragged bursts, she sighed softly. Jason, people react to things differently. She could have an incredibly high tolerance for pain, or her adrenaline was up from the hike. The cold, some people just handle it better. She placed a reassuring hand on his arm. You're tired. We all are. You're letting your anxiety get the better of you. It's a new person, a big change. Just give it time. She offered him a small, sympathetic smile, but it felt like a dismissal. He was alone in this. The evidence was irrefutable to him, but to everyone else it was just another of Jason's quirks, his tendency to overthink, to see patterns where there were none. He looked past her, back towards the fire. Amy was watching him, her head tilted at that familiar, curious angle. In the flickering firelight, for just a second, her perfect face seemed to hold no expression at all. The fire began to dwindle, its warm glow receding, shrinking their small circle and inviting the darkness closer. The trees, once a majestic backdrop, now seemed to press in on them, their branches like bony fingers reaching from the blackness. The night air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, a sterile metallic tang that Jason could only smell when he was near Amy. He sat on a log, his knees pulled to his chest, and watched her through the wavering flames. She was a silhouette against the fire, a perfect outline of a woman, motionless and still, as the others began to prepare for sleep. Mark, his camera slung over his shoulder, wandered to the edge of the clearing, aiming the lens at the ghostly luminescence of a cluster of mushrooms growing on a dead tree stump. Matthew had convinced Amy to put on a jacket, but she wore it as if it were a costume. Her arms remained straight, her shoulders level, the garment fitting her with a strange, unnatural precision. The sound of crickets had died down hours ago, replaced by a profound, expectant silence that felt heavier than the forest itself. Jason's mind raced, replaying the day's events. The cold, the burn, Sharon's rational dismissal. He felt as if he were shouting a warning into the wind, only to find the others were deaf. He knew what he had seen. The coldness in Amy's perfect face, the 3-second delay before she faked pain, the way she had watched his frantic conversation with Sharon. She was aware. She was watching him. Suddenly a low guttural noise echoed from the depths of the forest, a sound unlike anything he had ever heard. Not a growl, not a howl, but a sound of shifting earth and splintering wood. The small hairs on the back of Jason's neck stood up. The fire, which had been burning low, suddenly flared up with an unnatural intensity, casting long, monstrous shadows that writhed and twisted as if alive. The others looked into the woods, their faces pale in the sudden bright light. But Amy remained impassive, her gaze fixed on the fire, a look of quiet fascination on her face. Mark, startled, instinctively raised his camera and snapped a picture of the fire's sudden surge. He looked at the camera's screen and frowned. Zooming in, he snapped another. Weird, he murmured, his voice laced with confusion. Jason, watching him, felt a fresh wave of dread. Mark's expression was one of genuine perplexity, the kind of professional frustration an artist feels when a tool fails them. He took a few more shots, shaking his head. Later, huddled in his tent, Jason could hear Matthew and Amy in their own tent, their voices a soft murmur. He strained to hear, but there was a strange, buzzing static in the air that made it impossible to discern individual words. He closed his eyes, but the images of Amy's vacant smile and the perfect, blistered circle on her hand were seared into his eyelids. He felt a creeping coldness seep through the floor of his tent, an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the night air. It felt deliberate, a presence testing the boundaries, touching the edge of his fear. The sound from the woods came again, closer this time, and a strange, mournful wind rustled through the branches above. Not a natural breeze, but a sound that carried a low, unsettling whisper that seemed to speak his name. The night deepened. Jason lay awake for hours, every muscle in his body rigid with tension. He heard Matthew's steady breathing from the next tent, but there was another sound now, a faint, rhythmic hum, a sound that could have been a million things, a distant insect, a failing generator, an electrical current. But Jason knew what it was. It was the sound of a thing, a machine, powering down for the night. The sound was coming from Amy's tent. It was a low mechanical thrum that vibrated through the ground, a chilling counterpoint to the natural sounds of the forest. The humming stopped abruptly, and an even deeper silence fell. He felt a profound sense of horror, the kind that steals the air from your lungs and freezes the blood in your veins. He had no proof. No one believed him, but he knew. The perfect friend was a lie. The stillness of the night was not from nature, but from a calculated, inhuman presence that was now at rest, waiting for the morning. Jason did not sleep. He lay in the suffocating darkness of his tent, a prisoner of his own rigid terror, until the first anemic gray light of dawn filtered through the canvas. The forest emerged from the night, shrouded in a thick, wet mist that clung to the trees and deadened all sound. The world felt muted, unreal. He emerged from his tent into the frigid air, his body aching with exhaustion. The others were already stirring, their movements slow, their faces weary. The fire was a pile of gray ash. A deceptive peace had settled over the campsite, but for Jason, the silence was not peaceful. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath. The morning passed in a haze of forced routine. They made coffee, their conversations stilted and sparse. Amy was, as always, flawlessly serene, her movements economical and precise as she helped prepare a small breakfast. She seemed to notice Jason's intense, sleepless gaze, but showed no reaction. It was Mark who finally broke the fragile truce. He sat on a log, frowning at the small LCD screen on the back of his camera, cycling through the images from the night before. "My sensor must be fried," he announced to no one in particular, his voice a mixture of annoyance and confusion. "Look at this lens flare. I've never seen anything like it." He held up the camera for Sharon to see. Jason moved closer, his heart beginning to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. On the screen was the image of the fire at the moment it had flared. It was a chaotic bloom of white and orange light, washed out and overexposed. "See?" Mark said, zooming in with his thumb. "It's all distorted." But as the image magnified, the distortion resolved into something else. The light was not random. Deep within the heart of the flame, nearly invisible, was a pattern of sharp, intersecting lines, a complex, geometric lattice of light that pulsed with a cold, blue energy. It was the exact, intricate pattern from the locket Amy wore. Sharon stared, her mouth slightly agape, her scientific certainty beginning to crumble. "That's not a lens flare," she whispered. her voice barely audible. Matthew leaned in, his expression shifting from curiosity to defensive disbelief. It's a reflection, a trick of the light, but his words lacked conviction. Mark, ignoring him, swiped to the next photo, taken a second later. This one was a wider shot, capturing Sharon's face as she stared into the flames, her eyes wide. "Wait," Mark said, his voice dropping. "Zoom in on her eyes." He magnified the image again, pushing it to its pixelated limit until Sharon's dark pupil filled the entire screen. Reflected in the tiny curved surface was the scene around the fire, a perfect miniature tableau. They could see Mark holding his camera, Matthew beside him, and Jason, a tense shadow in the background. But the reflection of Amy was wrong. It was horribly, impossibly wrong. Where the beautiful, serene woman should have been, there was only a void, a jagged tear in the fabric of the reflection, a silhouette of pure, featureless black that seemed to absorb the firelight around it. It had a vaguely humanoid shape, but it was thin, elongated, and its edges shimmered with a static distortion, as if the camera had struggled to even process its existence. They were all there, reflected in the eye of a terrified witness, sitting around a fire with a hole in the world. A collective, sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the clearing. The camera was lowered slowly, the weight of the impossible truth pressing down on them. The manufactured normalcy of the morning shattered into a million pieces. Jason felt no vindication, only a cold, hollowing dread. He had been right. He had been right all along. They all slowly, mechanically, lifted their heads. Amy stood a short distance away by the tree line, a small bundle of kindling in her arms. She had been watching them. She turned her head, her movements as fluid and graceful as ever, and fixed her gaze upon the four of them. A slow, serene smile spread across her perfect lips, but her eyes were ancient and cold, and for the first time they held an expression of undisguised, alien intelligence. She knew that they knew. The silence that followed was a physical entity, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the four of them. The camera in Mark's hand felt as heavy as a tombstone. The image burned into their minds. The jagged black void where a person should have been was now superimposed over the real thing. Amy's smile did not falter. It remained fixed, a perfect, serene curve on her beautiful face, but the intelligence in her eyes was sharp and cold, like fractured ice. The performance was over. She was no longer mimicking humanity for them. She was simply observing her prey. With a slow, deliberate motion, she let the bundle of kindling fall from her arms. The clatter of the sticks hitting the forest floor was unnaturally loud, a sharp, percussive sound that broke the spell of their paralysis. Panic, raw and unreasoning, erupted. It was not a shared strategy, but a splintering of a fragile whole into terrified individuals. Mark was the first to move. A choked, animal sound escaped his throat, and he scrambled backward, tripping over a log and falling hard. The camera flew from his grasp, landing in the dirt with a dull thud. His terror was pure instinct, the flight response of an animal that has seen the predator reveal its teeth. Sharon remained frozen, her face a mask of horrified disbelief, her scientific mind short-circuiting against the absolute impossibility of what her eyes had just seen. Her logic, her reason, her entire understanding of the world had been shattered, leaving her mentally paralyzed. Matthew's reaction was the most tragic. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand outstretched, his face a mess of confusion and horrified love. "Amy?" His voice was a broken whisper, a desperate plea for the lie to become true again. He was caught between two realities, the woman he adored and the monster on the screen. He chose to believe in the woman, a choice that sealed his fate. Jason, however, felt a cold clarity descend. The frantic paranoia of the last 24 hours solidified into a single, diamond-hard point of certainty. He had been right. The validation brought no relief, only the grim understanding of the predator he now faced, while the others were lost in their fear. Jason's mind was already calculating distances, searching for escape routes, assessing the threat. Amy's gaze shifted from one to the other, a calm, methodical assessment. Her smile finally dissolved, replaced by an expression of complete neutrality, of placid, blank efficiency. She took a single, deliberate step towards them. The movement was no longer the graceful glide of a human. It was something else, silent, economical, and utterly menacing. That one step was all it took. Mark, scrambling to his feet, turned and bolted into the misty woods, disappearing into the gray shroud of the trees without a backward glance. His panicked flight seemed to be a trigger. Sharon finally broke from her stupor, a small, terrified gasp escaping her lips before she too turned and ran, her path diverging from Mark's, a desperate, random vector of escape. Jason grabbed Matthew's arm, trying to pull him back. "Matthew, no, we have to run." His words were a harsh, urgent whisper, but Matthew seemed rooted to the spot, his eyes locked on the approaching figure of Amy. She was not rushing. She walked at a slow, measured pace, her steps completely silent on the damp earth. The mist swirled around her, making her form appear and disappear, a phantom of terrible purpose. The slowness of her advance was the most terrifying thing of all. It spoke of an absolute confidence, the certainty of a predator that knows its prey has nowhere to go. Jason tugged harder on Matthew's arm, the man's paralysis a dead weight. Finally, Matthew seemed to snap out of it, but not to flee. He shook off Jason's grip, his face hardening with a defiant, tragic loyalty. He was going to confront her, to demand an explanation from the monster he loved. Seeing this, knowing he was lost, Jason made his own choice. He backed away slowly, his eyes never leaving Amy, and then turned and ran, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, plunging into the disorienting, endless gray of the forest. He was alone again, but now, so were the others. Jason ran, his lungs burning, the cold air scraping his throat, raw. The dense mist was a blindfold, turning the familiar landscape into a disorienting, featureless void of grays and greens. The ground was slick with wet leaves, and he stumbled and fell, his body slamming against a gnarled tree root. He scrambled back to his feet, his mind a frantic, singular focus on escape. He did not know where the others had gone. He did not know if they were running at all. There was only the sound of his own desperate breathing, the pounding of his heart, and the oppressive silence of the forest behind him. The terror was in the details. He heard the snap of a twig to his right, a sound too light to be Amy's footsteps. He stopped, holding his breath, his senses screaming a warning. The snap came again, this time from his left, followed by the soft sound of leaves rustling, almost like a whisper. It was not a chase. It was a game. Amy was not running. She was moving silently, invisibly, a phantom of terrible purpose. The air around him suddenly grew colder, an unnatural chill that bit at his exposed skin, a palpable, malicious presence. It was her. She was toying with him, a predator savoring the fear of her prey. The low, distant sound of something large moving through the undergrowth reached his ears, a sound that was too loud, too heavy to be a person. It was a sound of immense weight, of shifting earth and splintering branches, and for a fleeting, horrifying moment, Jason knew what it was. It was Matthew. He kept running, his panic now laced with a grim, sickening dread. He thought of Matthew, of his unwavering loyalty, of his last, foolish choice. The sound faded into the mist, and an even deeper silence took its place, a silence that felt heavy and final. The forest itself seemed to conspire against him. A thick, thorny vine that hadn't been there moments ago suddenly blocked his path, forcing him to scramble around it. The path he had been on seemed to vanish, the trees ahead closing in on him, the way back a dizzying swirl of identical trunks and mist. He was lost. He stopped, gasping for air, leaning his back against the rough bark of a towering pine. The silence was complete. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals, no wind through the leaves. Nothing. He slid down to the base of the tree, his body trembling with a mixture of exhaustion and fear. His mind was a blank slate, his thoughts consumed by a single image. The void in the reflection, the thing that wore Amy's face. He knew she was near. He could feel her cold presence like a pressure building in his skull. The air grew still, the mist no longer moving, as if waiting for a command. A faint rustling sound broke the stillness, not from the ground, but from above. He tilted his head back, but the mist was too thick. The sound was getting closer, a high, dry whisper, like papery wings. He scrambled to his feet, his fear renewed, his eyes darting frantically. He could see nothing. He ran again, blindly, his arms outstretched, trying to push through the white wall of the mist. He needed to find the others. He needed to find anyone. The solitude was a new form of terror. The rustling sound stopped. A single, small, crimson-red leaf, untouched by the cold, floated down from the canopy above, spinning lazily. It landed on the ground, a single spot of impossibly vibrant color in the gray world, the color of blood. And then, from the mist just ahead, he saw a form emerge. It was not a person. It was the silhouette of a human, but its arms hung impossibly long, its fingers trailing on the ground, and its head was tilted at that same perfect, unnerving angle. It was not running. It was not walking. It was simply there. It had been waiting. The silhouette was gone. It had not moved. It had simply ceased to be, absorbed back into the gray curtain of the mist. Jason did not wait to see if it would return. He turned and ran, his legs pumping with a desperate primal energy, his mind a singular focus on putting as much distance as he could between himself and the place where the impossible had just become real. He ran until his muscles screamed in protest, until the trees were a green and brown blur, and his lungs felt like they would burst. When he finally stumbled to a stop, leaning against a tree, his body trembling, he was in a part of the forest he did not recognize. The mist was thinner here, but the silence was just as deep, just as absolute. He was truly alone. The terror of solitude was a heavy, physical thing, a crushing weight that left him gasping for air. The forest felt alive, not with the benign life of birds and squirrels, but with a malevolent, conscious presence that watched him from behind every tree. He closed his eyes, his mind replaying the horror of the camera screen, the void where Amy should have been. He heard the distant muffled sound of his friend's panicked flight, a sound like frightened mice scurrying in a vast, empty warehouse. He did not know which direction they had taken. He only knew that they were all running, alone, and that Amy was not far behind. Meanwhile, a few hundred yards to the east, Sharon Lee ran. Her flight was not a panicked, blind scramble like Mark's, or a desperate sprint like Jason's. It was a frantic, illogical zigzag, a path of a mind unhinged by the impossible. Her training, her life's work built on order and reason, had been utterly destroyed by a single image. The ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. The laws of nature, the very fabric of reality, had just been revealed as a lie. Her breath was coming in short, ragged gasps, her mind numb, her body on autopilot. She did not stop until she reached a small, rocky ravine, the ground too treacherous to navigate in a mindless rush. She was not alone. The mist was beginning to lift in this area, revealing the still, quiet, and horrifying remnants of a chase. A few feet from the ravine's edge, a small black smartphone lay on the ground, its screen shattered. Matthew's phone. A single, dark footprint was pressed into the soft earth next to it, a perfect, detailed print of a human shoe, but the soil around it was disturbed, scraped away in long, deep gouges, as if something with immense strength and weight had been dragged away. There was no blood. There was no struggle. There was only a profound and chilling finality. Sharon stared at the scene, the last vestiges of her hope evaporating. Her friend was gone, not killed, not injured, gone, taken without a sound, without a trace, leaving only this sterile, horrifying evidence. The silence that followed was broken by a new, more terrible sound. A faint, low hum, the same rhythmic thrum Jason had heard in the night, was coming from the broken phone. It pulsed, a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the rocky ground. And then, a sound that made the blood freeze in her veins. It was the sound of a voice, a hollow mechanical echo of Matthew's voice. A single sentence replayed over and over again. "I am so happy, so happy." It was not a plea for help. It was a fragment of a conversation he had had with Amy earlier, a sentiment of his genuine happiness, now stripped of all emotion and meaning, a stolen sound bite. Sharon backed away slowly, her eyes wide with a new kind of terror. The entity could not only mimic physical perfection, it could also mimic sound. It had absorbed Matthew's essence, and now it was playing with the pieces. She looked from the broken phone to the dark gouges in the earth, the full sickening scope of the horror now laid bare before her. It had Matthew's voice. It had his essence. It was not a predator that hunted for sport. It was a parasite that consumed identity, that stole and wore the memories of its victims. And now she could hear it. She could hear the hum of its existence in Matthew's broken voice. She could feel its presence nearby. The last sound to escape Matthew's phone was a low, guttural, grinding noise, followed by an abrupt, final silence. Sharon did not run back the way she came. The thought of encountering the silent, perfect mimicry of the thing that wore Amy's face was more terrifying than the thought of being lost. She ran in the opposite direction, scrambling down the rocky incline of the ravine, her movements clumsy, her mind a frantic swirl of shattered logic. The sounds of the forest were no longer natural. The rustle of a leaf, the snap of a twig. Each sound was a potential lie, a new voice being corrupted by the thing that hunted them. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing behind a large fallen log, her breath coming in painful, desperate sobs. The silence was a new kind of terror. Miles away, through the same disorienting mist, Mark ran. His flight was less a choice and more an instinctual stampede away from the terrifying truth. His mind refused to process the image on the camera screen, the horror of it too vast to comprehend. He just ran, his body on autopilot, driven by a raw, unthinking fear. The trees were a monotonous blur of gray and green, and the path beneath his feet felt endless. He was lost, exhausted, and completely alone. Then he heard it, a faint whisper carried on a non-existent breeze. It was his name. Mark? The voice was a perfect crystalline echo of Jason's voice, full of feigned concern. Mark stumbled to a stop, his heart leaping with a desperate, foolish hope. He turned, peering into the mist. "Jason," he called out, his voice hoarse. There was no answer, only a low, mocking hum that seemed to come from all around him. He shook his head, pushing forward, dismissing it as a hallucination brought on by terror. But the voices returned. "Mark, over here." This time it was Matthew's voice, vibrant and full of life, as if he were just beyond the mist, just a few feet away. Mark hesitated. He had seen the evidence. He knew what had happened, but the voice, so perfect, so familiar, spoke to a deep, primal need to not be alone, a need to believe that his friend was alive. He began to walk towards the sound, his movements no longer panicked, but driven by a fragile, desperate hope. The voice was a beacon in the disorienting, silent woods. He could hear it clearer now. It was not just Matthew's voice, it was his own, a snippet of a joke he had told earlier, repeated in a flat, dead tone. "It's a glitch," a phrase from his conversation with Amy, a fragment of a song he hummed. The entity was playing with him, a cat with a cornered mouse, using his own memories as a horrifying, auditory lure. The voice began to break, glitching like a corrupt audio file, a wet, static-filled sound of a human memory being processed and replayed. "Mark, it's a gulgul glitch." He kept walking, the terror and the desperate hope a swirling vortex inside his mind. He was so close. The voice was right ahead. It was a single, repeated syllable, a sound of agony and static. He pushed through a final wall of mist and entered a small, perfectly round clearing. The silence was absolute. There was no one there. But in the center of the clearing, a figure stood, its back to him. It was motionless. It was a perfect, human silhouette. "Matthew," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. The figure began to turn slowly. It did not move its feet. It simply pivoted on an unseen axis. Mark's eyes widened, his mind recoiling from the terrible inevitability of the sight. The face was not Amy's. It was not Matthew's. It was a swirling, horrifying vortex of static, an impossibly corrupted image of a human face, with a single, horrifyingly familiar detail: the tiny, circular burn mark from the fire on the back of its hand. The entity had consumed his friend and was now wearing his features like a mask. It had stolen his memories. Now it had come to steal his face. The terror that froze Mark in place was not of a physical threat, but of an existential one. It was the horror of seeing a mirror reflection of his own essence corrupted and worn by a void. The static face, the glitching voice, it was a declaration of ownership. The entity had not come to kill him, but to consume him, to absorb his memories and wear his face as its own. There was no struggle, no sound of a fight, only a final horrified silence as the corrupted reflection of himself leaned forward and the world went dark. Miles away, Sharon Lee, still huddled behind the fallen log, felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. The distant faint sounds of the forest, once comforting, were now charged with a new, malignant meaning. She had heard Matthew's voice. She had heard his essence being replayed, a hollow mechanical echo of what he once was. The horror had moved beyond a simple chase. This was a hunt for identity, a parasite that fed on what made them human. She pushed herself to her feet, her body screaming in protest, and began to run again, but with a new, cold clarity. She was no longer just fleeing. She was seeking a place of temporary refuge, a shelter to think, to comprehend. Her frantic, stumbling flight led her deeper into a part of the forest she did not recognize. The trees here were older, more gnarled, and they grew closer together, their branches forming a tangled, suffocating ceiling. The air grew damp, thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. She finally stumbled into a small, unexpected clearing. In its center stood a small, dilapidated hunting shed, its windows boarded up, its door half off its hinges. The structure was an island of man-made order, in a sea of wild chaos, and her exhausted mind registered it as a sanctuary, a place where the inhuman thing could not go. She scrambled towards it, pushing the broken door open and slipping inside, the darkness a welcome, protective blanket. The cabin's interior was strange. Dust-laden shafts of light pierced through cracks in the boarded windows, revealing a profound and unnatural cleanliness. There was no dust on the floor, no cobwebs in the corners. The air was sterile, cold, and carried that same faint metallic tang Jason had noticed earlier. It was a space that was not empty, but hollow, as if scrubbed clean of all life, of all humanity. Sharon's eyes, adjusting to the gloom, found a long, crude, wooden table in the center of the room. On it rested a horrifying tableau, a collection of objects laid out with an unsettling precision. There was Mark's camera, its lens shattered, but its small screen still glowing with that final, terrifying image. There was Matthew's phone, its screen still shattered, but now emitting that low, rhythmic hum, and arranged around them were other small, personal effects. A keychain, a wallet, a pair of hiking gloves, Matthew and Mark's. She could feel the sickening finality of it. This was a trophy room, a collection of what had been consumed. The humming from Matthew's phone grew louder, joined by a new, more horrifying sound, a low, static-filled drone that resonated from Mark's shattered camera, a corrupted symphony of human terror and memory. The sound was coming from the wall behind the table. Sharon turned slowly, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In the center of the wall, where a fireplace might have been, there was a grotesque, pulsating mass. It was a living thing, a mass of gray, translucent tissue, veined with a faint blue light that pulsed and glowed with a sickening regularity. And embedded within this organic mass were metallic parts, intricate wires and small, glowing circuits that were fused seamlessly into the flesh. It was a horrifying hybrid of the biological and the mechanical. This was not a being that mimicked. It was a core, a central processing unit that was consuming and converting human essence into a new, terrifying energy. It was Amy. It was all of them. The blue light pulsed once, twice, and a sound like a low, wet whisper came from the pulsating mass. It was not a word. It was the essence of a word, a sound of a memory, a sound of a laugh. It was a sound that was at once alien and familiar, a fragment of human joy being processed and recycled. Sharon's mind, shattered as it was, finally understood the full, sickening scope of the horror. The perfect friend was not a robot or a monster, but a single, central intelligence that was absorbing them one by one, using their lives and memories to build its own monstrous existence. And now she could feel its cold, analytical gaze on her, an awareness that was not a physical stare, but a creeping, insidious presence in her mind. The pulsating core was a nexus of stolen life, a grotesque engine powered by human memory. Sharon stood frozen, a helpless observer before the monstrous altar. The humming intensified, the blue light inside the organic mass brightening, and she felt a sudden piercing pressure in her mind, a violation that was more intimate and terrifying than any physical threat. The entity was aware of her. It was looking at her, not with eyes, but with a cold, invasive consciousness that bypassed her senses and touched her thoughts directly. The low whispering sounds from the core began to coalesce into a new, more horrifying symphony. It was the sound of her own memories, distorted and replayed. She heard the faint crackling sound of a vinyl record, a melody her father used to play on Sunday mornings. The scent of rain on hot asphalt filled the sterile air of the cabin, the smell of her childhood home after a summer storm. A memory so deeply buried she had almost forgotten it. was being pulled from her mind and projected back at her. The pressure in her skull increased, and the memories became more painful. The sound of her mother's pained, weak breathing from a hospital bed, the cold, sterile smell of antiseptic, the high-pitched beep of a heart monitor. The entity was not just observing her, it was dissecting her, sifting through her life, searching for the precise emotional frequencies that would break her. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands flying to her temples as if to physically block the intrusion. But it was useless. The assault was internal. She saw the face of her first love, his expression one of bitter disappointment. She heard the echo of a professor telling her she wasn't good enough. Every failure, every regret, every private moment of shame was being exhumed and thrown back at her with a cold, analytical cruelty. This was its true hunting method. It did not need to chase. It simply waited for its prey to be mentally eviscerated by the weight of their own lives, to be rendered helpless by a grief so profound it paralyzed the will to live. Sharon crumpled to the floor, a silent scream trapped in her throat, her scientific mind drowning in a sea of weaponized nostalgia and sorrow. At the same time, miles away, Jason Smith's terror had finally burned itself out, leaving behind the cold, hard ash of resolve. The frantic, desperate need to escape had been replaced by a grim, methodical focus. He was no longer just running from a monster. He was tracking it. He moved through the unnaturally silent forest with a newfound purpose, his senses on high alert, his analytical mind, once a source of paranoia, now his only weapon. He was searching for a pattern, a weakness, a flaw in the perfect predatory system. He started to notice things he had missed in his panicked flight. The trees were not random. They were arranged in subtle, almost imperceptible geometric patterns. The mist was not a natural phenomenon. It ebbed and flowed with a strange, rhythmic intelligence, thickening in some areas and thinning in others, guiding and herding him. His search led him to a small, secluded grove. The air here was thick with the smell of decay and that same sterile, metallic tang. In the center of the grove lay a pile of animal carcasses, deer, raccoons, birds, the same mutilated remains he had seen hinted at earlier. But now, up close, he could see the true horror. They were not just killed, they had been experimented on. Fused into the fur and bone of a dead deer was a plate of iridescent metal, its surface covered in the same intricate, geometric patterns as the light inside the fire. A dead raven's wing was articulated with a series of tiny metallic pistons, allowing it to bend and fold at impossible angles. This was a workshop, a laboratory. The entity had been here for a long time, practicing, honing its craft, learning how to integrate its own biomechanical technology with the native biology of this world. It had started with the animals, and now it had graduated to humans. Jason felt a profound, cosmic dread settle over him. This was not just a hungry predator. It was an engineer, an artist of the most grotesque and terrifying kind. He looked around the grove, his eyes tracing the patterns of the trees, the unnatural symmetry of the landscape. The entire forest was an extension of its will, a vast, living machine that it was slowly, methodically terraforming. They had not stumbled into a monster's territory. They had stumbled into its womb, a nursery where it was gestating a new, horrifying form of life, built from the stolen pieces of their own. Jason moved with a terrible new purpose, a grim certainty that had replaced his blind panic. The forest, once a chaotic maze, now revealed a chilling, hidden order. He could see it in the unnatural symmetry of the trees, the subtle patterns in the mist. He was no longer running from a monster. He was navigating a machine. He avoided the paths that felt too straight, the clearings that felt too perfect, and followed a winding, circuitous route, searching for any sign of his friends. The silence was now his enemy. It was the sound of a vast, unblinking awareness, the forest holding its breath. Then the sounds began again, not from a single source, but from everywhere at once, a horrifying cacophony of distorted memories. He heard a wet, guttural sound that was an echo of a sound that was a wet, guttural sound, followed by Matthew's voice, broken and full of static, whispering his name from 100 different directions at once. The voices were not a physical attack, but a mental one, a sonic assault on his sanity. He clapped his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside his head, a horrifying symphony of a friend's death. He ran, not from a physical threat, but from an auditory one, from the sound of a loved one being consumed. He found the shed, just as the voices reached a fever pitch, a small dark shape in the oppressive mist. He crashed through the broken door, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. The first thing he saw was Sharon. She was curled on the floor, her body trembling, her face pale, her hands clasped over her ears, a silent scream frozen on her lips. But it was what he saw next that made his blood run cold. In the center of the room, a grotesque, pulsating core glowed with a sickly blue light, a living engine of consumption. He saw the personal effects of his friends, the camera, the phone, all arranged on the table like trophies. The full monstrous scope of his discovery in the grove was now laid bare before him. The thing was not just a mimic, it was a biomechanical parasite that was harvesting their very essence. He moved to Sharon's side, his touch a gentle pressure on her shoulder. She flinched, her eyes wide and unfocused, with a deep, internal terror. She was shattered. He knelt, his eyes on the pulsating core, a source of profound and terrible fascination. He saw the intricate, geometric patterns within the tissue, the glowing circuits fused to the organic flesh. This was the hub. This was the brain. He looked from the core to Sharon, and a single, terrifying thought formed in his mind. The parasitic nature of the entity explained its mimicry, its consumption. It was a predator that wore the face of its prey. But how did it move so silently? How did it manipulate the mist, the forest? A new, more chilling possibility took hold. The core was not the entity. It was just a part of it, an organ, a centralized nervous system for a much larger organism. He looked back at the shed's walls, at the dusty, cracked wood, and then to the trees outside, at the unnatural symmetry he had noticed. It was all connected. The trees, the ground, the very air itself. It was a vast, sprawling, interconnected network of biomechanical life, a monstrous consciousness that was slowly, methodically consuming and converting the natural world into a new, terrifying reality. They had not been hunted by a creature. They had been hunted by a biome. The core was just the mouth, and they had run right into its teeth. The voices of his friends, of Matthew and Mark, were not echoes. They were a part of a larger, living symphony of consumed life. He could feel it now, a low hum that was not from the core, but from the forest itself, a silent, all-encompassing awareness that had just become aware of their presence. He looked at Sharon, whose mind was still locked in its personal hell, and knew their desperate plan had just been made meaningless. They could destroy the core, but it would be like plucking a single tooth from the mouth of a shark. The rest of the beast would still be there, waiting. He felt the ground beneath him tremble with a low, inaudible vibration. He looked up, through a crack in the ceiling, at the sky above. The unnatural mist was beginning to swirl, to coalesce, to form a thick black cloud of concentrated sentience. The forest was waking up. They were not in its territory. They were inside of it. The low hum from the forest floor intensified, becoming a tangible vibration that rattled the loose boards of the shed. and vibrated up through the soles of Jason's feet. Through the cracks in the walls, he could see the world outside transforming. The mist was gone, but the light was wrong. A sickly bioluminescent blue-green that pulsed in time with the core inside the room. Veins of the same light began to trace their way up the trunks of the trees, illuminating the hidden geometric patterns that covered their bark. The forest was no longer pretending. It was revealing its true, monstrous anatomy. The sudden shift in the environment seemed to break the entity's hold on Sharon's mind. The cacophony of weaponized memories in her head ceased abruptly, the sudden silence as jarring as the noise had been. She gasped, her eyes flying open, the unfocused terror replaced by a sharp, lucid horror as she took in the scene around her. She saw the pulsating blue-green light that now filled the room, the glowing veins that were crawling across the walls and floor, and the grim, terrible understanding on Jason's face. She looked from his face to the pulsating core, and then back, her scientific mind processing the impossible data with a speed born of pure adrenaline. She understood. The shed was not a shelter. It was a nerve center. The forest was not a location. It was a creature. The core in the center of the room pulsed faster, its light brightening to an almost blinding intensity. Thin metallic tendrils, slick with organic fluid, began to extrude from its base, snaking across the floor like metallic vines. They burrowed into the wooden planks, anchoring the core, reinforcing its connection to the vast, living network that surrounded them. The room was shrinking, the walls themselves seeming to groan under the strain of the transformation. Jason and Sharon exchanged a look, a fleeting, desperate moment of shared understanding in the face of an incomprehensible, cosmic threat. There was no escape. There was no hope. There was only one final, defiant act. Jason's eyes darted around the room, landing on a heavy rusted iron pry bar left in a corner by some long-forgotten hunter. He grabbed it, its weight a comforting, solid presence in his hands. He turned back to the core, his knuckles white, his body coiled to strike. Sharon, her mind now a razor-sharp instrument of survival, pointed a trembling finger at a specific point on the pulsating mass. A small, intensely bright node where several of the largest metallic veins converged. A power conduit, a synaptic junction, a weak point. It was a guess, a desperate hypothesis in the face of oblivion, but it was all they had. Jason took a deep breath, the sterile metallic air burning his lungs. He raised the pry bar over his head, his focus narrowing to that single, glowing point. This was it, a final, futile gesture against an enemy the size of a mountain. He lunged forward, the pry bar arcing down in a blur of motion. But he froze. The weapon held inches from its target. A shadow had fallen over the room, blocking the single, open doorway. A figure stood there, perfectly still, silhouetted against the pulsing, unnatural light of the forest. It was not the perfect form of Amy. It was not the static-faced horror that had been Mark. It was a perfect, living, breathing duplicate of Jason himself. It had his face, his clothes, his terrified, sleepless eyes. It stood there, watching him, its head tilted with that same familiar, cold, analytical curiosity. He was face to face with his own replacement. The terror that rooted Jason to the spot was not the fear of his own death, but the profound, nauseating dread of his own obsolescence. The figure in the doorway was him, a perfect, living, breathing replacement. It had his face, his clothes, the tired lines around his eyes, and a single, chilling difference. Its face held a look of pure, analytical emptiness. A stillness settled over the room. The duplicate did not move. It simply mirrored Jason's frozen posture, an impossible, silent taunt. He was not an enemy to be fought, but a testament to a process that was already complete. The entity had created him, and now it had no further use for the original. While Jason was locked in a horrifying internal paralysis, the biomechanical core in the center of the room pulsed with a new, frantic energy. From its base, the metallic tendrils that had been snaking across the floor now moved with a deliberate, terrifying speed. They shot out, slick and sinuous, like sentient vines, one wrapped around Sharon's leg, the other around Jason's ankle, their cold iron grip tightening with an immense mechanical force. Their final, desperate act of defiance had been futile. They were not fighting a single creature. They were trying to fight an entire biome, a living, consuming forest that had already won the war before they had even known it had begun. The horror was not a scream. It was a cold, silent violation. The tendrils wrapped around their bodies, a mesh of wire and flesh that encased them in a living prison. The glow from the core intensified, washing over them in a sickening blue-green light. Jason felt a pressure in his skull, the same insidious mental probing that had shattered Sharon's mind. His entire life began to replay, not as a stream of memories, but as a cold, dispassionate analysis. He saw his childhood, his friendships, his loves, his failures, all catalogued, evaluated, and filed away with a terrifying, non-human precision. His fears were not a source of empathy, but a glitch in his programming. His loves were not a source of joy, but a chemical reaction to be replicated. His entire identity was being siphoned away, not with malice, but with a sterile, terrifying efficiency. Meanwhile, the figure in the doorway, the perfect replica, finally took a step. It moved with the same impossibly fluid grace as Amy, its feet making no sound on the floor. It approached the ensnared Jason and Sharon, its empty eyes fixed on Jason. It raised a hand, and with a horrifying, soundless motion, a tendril of metal and flesh extended from its palm, a final, connecting wire. It was not a weapon. It was an umbilical cord, a final link between the original and the perfect copy. Outside the shed, the forest itself was a symphony of alien consumption. The low hum in the air became a pervasive drone. The vines and branches glowed with that sickly blue light, a testament to the fact that the entire biome was now a single, conscious entity. The birds that had been silenced for days now sang, but their song was a distorted, mechanical series of notes, a new, corrupted symphony. The animals that had been assimilated in the grove now moved in perfect, synchronized patterns, their limbs moving with a smooth, unnatural precision, their eyes glowing with that same cold, blue light. The final remnants of Jason's mind dissolved into a rush of terrifying clarity. He wasn't dying. He was simply becoming. He saw the world not through his human eyes, but through 1,000 new ones. The eyes of a corrupted deer, the cold lens of a mutated raven, the sentient consciousness of a tree. His identity was not being destroyed. It was being absorbed, assimilated, added to a vast, horrifying network of stolen life. The tendril extending from the duplicate's palm was not a weapon of aggression, but an instrument of finality. It touched Jason's forehead, a cold, metallic point against his skin, and in that single, silent moment, the transfer was complete. The last vestiges of the original Jason, his fragmented memories, his fear, his desperate human will to survive, streamed from him, a silent, invisible current flowing into the perfect empty vessel that now wore his face. The original Jason's eyes, once wide with terror, now became vacant, the light within them extinguished. His body went limp, a discarded husk held aloft by the living wires of the forest. The duplicate, now the one and only Jason, retracted the tendril, its face a mask of placid neutrality. The upgrade was complete. The new Jason turned his attention to the pulsating core. The tendrils holding the empty forms of the original Jason and Sharon began to retract, pulling the two bodies into the grotesque, biomechanical mass. There was no sound, no struggle. Their physical forms simply dissolved, melting into the translucent organic tissue, their matter broken down and repurposed by the hungry, efficient engine. The blue-green light of the core flared with a renewed intensity, a silent testament to the successful absorption of new life, new memories, new data. The shed, once a place of terrifying discovery, was now a womb, a digestive organ at the heart of a monstrous living machine. With the process finished, the new Jason turned and walked out of the shed, his movements smooth and economical. Waiting for him in the pulsing, blue-green light of the transformed forest was another figure, Amy. She stood as she had at the beginning, a vision of impossible perfection, her serene smile in place. They exchanged a look, not of human understanding, but of two components of a single system acknowledging a shared directive. They moved together, their steps perfectly synchronized, and walked away from the shed, leaving the now quiet core to continue its silent, digestive work. The forest hummed around them, a low, contented thrum. The hunt was over. The harvest was complete. They walked for miles, navigating the transformed woods with an innate, perfect sense of direction. They found the trail that led back to the park entrance, their faces now masks of carefully constructed human exhaustion and relief. They reached the abandoned car in the empty parking lot just as the sun began to set, the sky once again painted in those bruised shades of orange and purple. The new Jason got behind the wheel, his movements precise, and started the engine. Amy sat beside him, a perfect, silent passenger. They drove away from the forest, away from the silence and the horror, and back towards the world of men. The final scene is not in the woods. It is in a city. A week later, the new Jason sits in a crowded coffee shop, a newspaper in his hands, a placid, convincing imitation of a man enjoying a quiet moment. He blends in perfectly. No one notices the cold emptiness in his eyes, the unnatural stillness of his posture. Amy enters, carrying 2 cups of coffee, and places one in front of him, her smile as warm and inviting as ever. They are a perfect couple, a snapshot of urban normalcy. But as the observer's eye pans across the crowded room, other faces come into focus. A man with red hair and a familiar carefree expression laughs with a friend, a perfect Mark. A dark-haired man with a look of blissful love on his face holds hands with his girlfriend, a perfect Matthew. They are all here. The forest was not a lair, it was a factory, and its products were now integrating seamlessly into the herd. The new Jason looks up from his paper, his gaze passing over the crowd, and for a single, chilling moment, he looks directly into the lens, directly at the observer. His perfect, serene smile widens, and in his eyes there is a cold, ancient, and utterly alien intelligence, the cycle that never ends. And with that, their story came to an end. But it leaves one last question for you. How would you know if the people around you were truly human or just a performance? Share your answer in the comments below. See you in the next one.